As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
Last week, President Biden delivered a dark and angry speech meant to convince the low percentage of Americans who still feel positive about his presidency that everything is fine and will only get better if he is reelected for a second term. Unfortunately, we have come a long way from the optimism of a Ronald Reagan, who won a second term partially on the popularity of his Morning in America campaign in commercials. Reagan was far from a perfect president, but it was that sense of optimism in otherwise difficult times that resulted in a record re-election victory. Biden's speech, by contrast, was dark and angry, attacking not only his political opponents, but even seeming to threaten the Supreme Court. As constitutional law professor Jonathan Turley observed recently, in some ways, the State of the Union speech may have died when former Speaker Nancy Pelosi ripped up the address of former President Donald Trump. While many in the media celebrated her lack of decorum and respect, she tore up something far more important than a speech. She shredded decades of traditions of civility and any remaining residue of restraint in our politics. We seem to be becoming a nation that would rather scream at each other than listen to each other. The message of Biden's speech was that if you do not support the re-election of Joe Biden, you are an insurrectionist and hate America and democracy. 7 years after the launch of the Russiagate hoax against then-candidate Donald Trump, it becomes clearer that the line "our democracy" means is only democratic when their side gets elected. It's understandable that Biden is so angry. Despite all the lying with statistics about the economy, Americans can clearly see for themselves how inflation is undermining the standard of living. Of course, this is not all Biden's fault. Republicans in control of the House show little interest in really cutting spending, but people generally blame the president of the state of the economy. We are no better off on foreign policy either. President Biden started his speech by comparing Russian President Vladimir Putin with Hitler, claiming that Putin is on the march in Europe, just as Hitler was in 1941. And that's just as in those days. If he is not stopped in Ukraine, he will continue to rampage through the continent. It was blatant fear-mongering based on no evidence. In fact, as Putin told Tucker Carlson just weeks ago, he has no interest in taking the war beyond Ukraine. But Biden is determined to spend another $61 billion on the failed proxy war in Ukraine, and he is willing to say whatever he feels necessary to get that money. Biden also introduced a bizarre plan to build a temporary pier on the shores of Gaza so that the U.S. could deliver aid to starving Palestinians. Considering the billions of dollars and tens of thousands of missiles we have shipped to Israel, wouldn't it just be easier to inform the Israel Prime Minister that we would either be delivering aid to Palestinians over land or else? In all, Biden's final State of the Union before the election reveals a president and administration that is out of gas and out of ideas. It also reveals a country deep in bankruptcy, both moral and economic. It is high time for a nationwide movement toward liberty. Thanks for listening.
So an annual threat assessment compiled by U.S. intelligence agencies was released on Monday and said that Israel will likely face resistance from Hamas for years to come. And this is just more evidence that Netanyahu's stated goal of eradicating Hamas is not realistic. So this threat assessment, again, this is compiled by all the U.S. intel agencies. It says, quote, Israel probably will face lingering armed resistance from Hamas for years to come, and the military will struggle to neutralize Hamas's underground infrastructure, which allows insurgents to hide, regain strength, and surprise Israeli forces, end quote. So this assessment actually aligns with an Israeli military document that was circulated last month and said even if Israel succeeded in dismantling Hamas as an organized military force, the group would still exist as a terror group and a guerrilla group. Other reports have said Israel is struggling to destroy the vast tunnel network underneath Gaza, that is key to Hamas's survival and is far more expansive than Israel initially thought. So the threat assessment did say that as well, that dismantling their underground infrastructure will be a challenge. And so I mentioned, I mentioned again something I covered a few months ago, that General Charles Q. Brown, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest-ranking U.S. military officer, he said back in November that the Israel's mass killing of civilians in Gaza will be a recruiting tool for Hamas. And he was saying that, you got to end hostilities. He said, quote, "The faster you can get to a point where you stop the hostilities, you have less strife for the civilian population that turns into someone who now wants to be the next member of Hamas," end quote. So look at all this evidence, U.S. intelligence basically saying Hamas can't be defeated. You have Israeli military intelligence saying the same thing. The highest-ranking U.S. military officer warning that Israel's tactics are just going to, create more Hamas fighters, but it doesn't matter. The U.S. still continues to provide unconditional aid for the slaughter of Palestinians in Gaza. The death toll, according to Gaza's health ministry, is now over 31,000. That's considered to be an undercount. I mean, it must be an undercount because they're not taking into counting the thousands of people who are under the rubble. There was some interesting stuff about Iran. It said that Iran had no role in Hamas's October 7th attack. And it also acknowledged that Tehran is not seeking a nuclear weapon. And it also said that Iran's increase in uranium enrichment since 2018 really started in 2019. They waited a year before they started increasing things. But since 2018, when the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal, it acknowledges that is all to build negotiating leverage, which is very obvious to anyone who understands what's going on with Iran. But those increases in enrichment are always used for the scaremongering that Iran's trying to build a nuclear weapon. So it's interesting to see U.S. intelligence say it's just for leverage for negotiations. So Polish Foreign Minister Radek Sikorski confirmed in comments on Friday that NATO troops are inside Ukraine, but he would not name the countries who have personnel on the ground. Sikorski said, quote, "NATO soldiers are present in Ukraine, and I would like to thank the ambassadors of those countries who have taken that risk. These countries know who they are, but I can't disclose them. Contrary to other politicians, I will not list those countries," end quote. So the fact that NATO troops are in Ukraine is an open secret. We know this, especially if you listen to the show, because I've been talking about it a lot lately, that the Discord leaks revealed last year that as of March 2023, there were 97 NATO Special Operations soldiers in the country. So a very small presence, but NATO troops on the ground nonetheless. And of course, this risks escalation and a direct war with Russia. And this issue has gotten much more attention since Macron, the French president, said recently that NATO has not ruled out the idea of sending troops. So in response to Sikorski's comments, Russia said, that there's no point in NATO continuing to claim that they don't have troops inside Ukraine because of these comments and other comments recently about that fact. There's also that leaked recording of German military officers that revealed British soldiers inside Ukraine are helping Ukrainian forces fire Storm Shadow missiles, which have a range of about 150 miles. So if this name, Sikorski, I believe I'm saying that right, Sikorski sounds familiar, that's because he was the Polish official. At the time, he was a member of the European Parliament. Now he's the foreign minister. And I believe he was the foreign minister and defense minister in previous governments. The day that the Nord Stream pipelines blew up, he was the one that tweeted a picture of it and said, "Thank you, USA." So he's the one that first pointed the finger at the U.S. And he deleted that tweet after a few days. And another interesting fact about this guy is that he's married to Anne Applebaum, who's an American writer, neocon, total neocon. I think she's at The Atlantic now. But he's definitely an interesting character. This is an article from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute, and it says, for years, several federal agencies have been spending U.S. tax dollars to buy Americans' data from private bulk sellers. As some members of Congress seek a new law against the practice, the Joe Biden administration is pushing back on the effort to curtail the power to buy the information that would otherwise require a warrant. So this is U.S. intelligence, military, and law enforcement agencies. They have gathered massive amounts of Americans' data through these private brokers, basically data that they collect from you while you're on the phone, on the computer, doing whatever. They sell to the government, and they don't need any sort of warrant or anything. So it's very intrusive. It's a very intrusive thing. So a bipartisan group of lawmakers has teamed up to stop the unconstitutional method of collecting massive amounts of Americans' information. And they introduced this bill that would prohibit the government from buying this stuff, although it would allow for the collection of data on foreign nationals, which that also would probably leave open some sort of loophole, to also collect stuff on Americans. But anyway, at least it's something here. And the White House is working against this and saying that they oppose this. So that's not really a surprise, but something so blatant for the White House to come out against it or in support of this sort of data harvesting.
Aren't there American troops in Ukraine just out of uniform? Certainly American intel is there, and American contractors there, and American soldiers of fortune are there. But are active duty troops, Army, Marines, on the ground in Ukraine?
Yes, there's active duty troops on the ground in Ukraine, hundreds of them. They're not in formal conventional combat units. They might be in an advisory capacity. They might be there for logistics purposes, for accounting purposes. There's teams of military people who are running around trying to keep track of these weapons, but there's definitely Americans on the ground. But here's the other thing I just think your audience needs to be reminded of. The 1948 legislation that created that transformed the military into a joint, this joint concept of military operations, that created the CIA and created the National Security Council. There's important language in there about the role of the National Security Council, which is, of course, a body that has no congressional oversight. And it talks about the fact that they can run a secret foreign policy. They can do things that are covert in nature, non-reportable to the American people, non-reportable to Congress. They can lie, they can cheat, they can steal, that Americans can have diplomats saying one thing while the CIA is doing another thing altogether. And that's just the way it is. So when the President of the United States, and this is the disturbing thing about that, when the President of the United States is speaking to the American people in the State of the Union address, saying something, understand that it's likely that he's lying to the American people, because we have secret foreign policy. And in Ukraine, we've never told the American public the truth. I mean, imagine what the discussion would have been in 2021 when we were talking about Russian troop movement, if the American people knew that the CIA since 2014 had 12 bases along the Ukrainian border, collecting intelligence for potential offensive strikes inside Russia. Imagine what the debate would be if we'd been informed of that. Instead, we're told, no, we're doing nothing. Those Russians are being aggressive. Those Russians, we haven't provoked the Russians. We do nothing but provoke them. And here's the other thing. The president may be able to lie to the American people. The Russians know darn well what's going on. They knew those 12 bases were there. They know what the American policy is, and that's why they act the way they do. It would be nice if we would just as a nation decide that we don't want a CIA that carries out covert foreign policies, that for once the American government, who reports to us, by the way, we the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, that's what I heard Abraham Lincoln say, that we actually are in charge. But what it is, we're dupes. We are literally dupes who elect a government who is allowed by law to lie to us, to carry out covert policy, to deny it to Congress. It's all deniable. And they're doing it over and over again. American ambassadors who work in the embassies across this country are not the number one voice of the American people. It's the CIA station chief.
The last president that tried to stop the CIA operations from overthrowing other countries had his brains blown out on November 22nd, 1963.
Yeah, but if I were the president of the United States, I could handle this very easily. It'd be called Night of the Long Knives. And all the CIA people wake up one morning with U.S. Marshals at their door. Their badges, their credentials would be taken away. Any weapons they had would be taken away. They'd be placed under, some sort of home arrest until we investigate their role in this. The CIA would be shut down. U.S. Marshals would flood in there and shut the whole thing down, seize the documents, remove the people, and the CIA would cease to exist overnight. That's the way you do it. You don't sit there and mumble about it, talk about it, and let these idiots who have their little covert things over there, you shut the whole thing down, Night of the Long Knives, and it's done. And it needs to happen, because I'm here to tell you right now, the CIA is running parallel government. They are running a parallel foreign policy, a parallel defense policy. We're being told one thing by the secretaries, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, who have to go before the U.S. Senate to be confirmed, and the CIA is doing something because they don't have to. They report to the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council, and there is no Senate confirmation process there. The American people need to take control of their government, take control of their foreign policy, take control of their defense policy.
How close is the United States to war, whether it's in the Middle East or in Ukraine? We have the president saying all the right things about trying to avoid a conflict. And under normal conditions, I would say, okay, I trust him on that. But what happens if is the problem? What happens if Israel and Hezbollah explode into a straight up war, and Hezbollah starts getting the upper hand, and the United States decides to intervene on behalf of Israel, and then Iran intervenes on behalf of Hezbollah, and now we're at war with Iran. Now we have a major war in the Middle East that we're not going to win. What happens if Macron decides that, even though that he's going to call Putin's bluff, that he's going to put 4 Rafale fighters at Ivano-Frankivsk airfield, back them up with Mamba air defense, and then put a brigade into Odessa to sit there at Odessa. And he's not going to attack the Russians. He's going to put the brigade in as a screening force, like a tripwire, with air defense and aircraft covering it. And Putin says, why'd you do that? And he kills them all. And now France is screaming bloody murder, and the president who said that NATO is a sacred obligation now has to do something, and next thing you know, we're at war with Russia, and that's the end of the world. So we're in a situation where we may not want to go to war, but we've created
policy conditions where we may be dragged into the war. And I'm really concerned about Ukraine right now because there seems to be an indifference on the part of the American people about what the consequences of war with Russia would be. I mean, you have people being dismissive of Russia's nuclear deterrence. They're just bluffing, they say. Russia doesn't bluff. They're not bluffing. And we are really at risk. If NATO wants to get involved, this thing will spiral out of control rapidly. And then the American people wake up the next morning and it's over. I mean, there's nuclear explosions going off and you're wondering, how the heck did this happen? Well, it's happening because you're not holding your government to account right now. You're not picking up the phone saying, I don't want to die in a nuclear holocaust. Let's stop this nonsense in Ukraine. Let's bring this under control. I, again, advise all Americans to call their congressman and just ask the following question. Why isn't Tony Blinken talking to Ambassador Anatoly Antonov at the Russian embassy to jumpstart arms control? Why haven't they engaged with Major General Yevgeny Babkin, the defense attaché, to talk about military on military discussions, to create confidence building measures to keep the conflict low? Why aren't we talking to these important Russians? Why are we keeping them in the dark, silent, ignoring them? Right now is the time to talk. Right now is the time to hear what they have to say, to begin a dialogue that could lead us away from this path towards war. Because by not talking to them, we become ignorant about Russia, and ignorance breeds fear. And then that fear breeds more ignorance and more harsh actions. And next thing you know, we're on an automatic path to a war that everybody claims they don't want. It's sort of like August or the summer of 1914 all over again. If you go back and look at June, July 1914, everybody in Europe said they don't want a major war. They don't want it. The diplomacy will stop. Don't worry about mobilization. Next thing you know, it's August, we're at war, and that's it, world war. That's where we are today. We're literally like in July 1914 right now, where everybody's saying we don't want a war, but they're not doing anything to stop a war.
The Pentagon needs Congress to hand over $10 billion to replace weapons sent to Ukraine. Now, this should have a huge question mark when people read this, I think, Dr. Paul, because put on the next one, here's a little bit into the article. Now, I highlighted this part. The Pentagon has sent $10 billion worth of weapons to Ukraine that it still does not have the money to replace due to congressional gridlock, according to a DoD official. Now, I just wonder about that due to a congressional gridlock, because at some point, I mean, did they just anticipate the money would be automatic? You know, you think that they might be asking the question, if we give $10 billion worth of weapons that we need to Ukraine, and we don't have the money already in the bank to pay for the new ones, maybe that's not such a good idea, you know?
But, you know, technically the money has been appropriated and is sitting there, but haven't had the final, they're down to the wire, and they're being business people, and we have to prepare. We can't give our last weapon away. We have to Congress has to give a guarantee that they're going to give us the money to replace it. So they use it as a political weapon and pressure. They don't care about these numbers, and so the money is there because when they print the money, if they don't have it, and they're not going to give up on it, which is a sad situation. And right now, though, I think the cards are in place for more Americans waking up because it's so stupid, so ridiculous, and the problems are going to be so bad, but they have to connect the problems. You know, it's when they wake up someday and say, why does bread cost me $20?
Yeah.
Oh, it has something to do with Ukraine. Oh, I don't believe that. Well, they have to become believers on what we're doing elsewhere and what we're doing in the military-industrial complex and printing all this money, and that's why their bread prices are going to go up a lot more.
You have to ask a question, what is the purpose of the U.S. military? And the answer should be to defend the United States. Well, if that is the situation, and put up the next clip if you can, if that is what it's made for, and that's what we sort of agree that we spend money for, then how is it that the military would give away the ability to defend the United States? This is from the same article. The DoD does not get the funding to backfill its stocks. The impact of that ongoing hole will ultimately be felt by the U.S. military's own forces, said the DoD official. So it would come back to our own readiness on our own stockpile to a certain extent if we can't get new funding. This is almost an admission of a crime. Yeah. They're admitting that they depleted the military. The military has been hollowed out. It can no longer protect the United States because they gave everything to a foreign country, to Ukraine.
Well, we must be getting closer to the end point. Dave DeCamp, in his article, he says, you know, even if they gave them the weapons, they don't have any troops left. and that is a real human tragedy. Not only have a lot of people lost their lives over there, innocent people and the military people, but also thinking about all the children who have died over there, and that goes on and on. But even if they got exactly what they want in weaponry, he says they don't have the troops to use them, which is a bit of irony. But that also means that could it be that some foreign troops might be filtering in there and getting prepared? That would be a terrible, terrible escalation, and we might talk about that in a little bit.
Yeah, and our good friend Thomas Massey, he always is so insightful. He always cuts right to the chase. Here's a tweet he put out this morning. The so-called TikTok ban is a Trojan horse. The president will be given the power to ban websites, not just apps. The person breaking the new law is deemed to be in the U.S. or offshore internet hosting service or app store, not the foreign adversary. So It's aimed toward Americans. Now, he put a couple of clips, if you could put the next one on. Here's from his tweet. Here's a clip from the proposed law. Foreign adversary controlled application. The term foreign adversary controlled application means a website, he has that highlighted, desktop app, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So website is what we're talking about. Go to the next one, please, from the bill, the TikTok ban. This prohibition of foreign adversary controlled applications providing services to distribute, maintain, or update such application, i.e. websites, and providing internet hosting services to said website. And just go to the next one. Here's his final word on this. If you think this isn't a Trojan horse and will only apply to TikTok and foreign adversary social media companies, then contemplate why someone thought it was important to get a very specific exclusion for their internet-based businesses written into the bill. And he puts a clip from the bill that talks about what places are excluded from this. And this has to do with it allows users to post product reviews, business reviews, or travel information and reviews. They are exempt from it. So sorry to be long-winded, Dr. Paul, but he cut to the chase here. This is about giving the president the power to ban websites he doesn't like.
Yes, and that's a can of worms because, yes, we want to cancel that one particular thing because that's anti-Chinese and that fits into that scenario. But are we offering up, oh, yes, by the way, we do it too, and we're going to get away with it. We're just going to laugh at you because we're more powerful and we have more weapons currently and we have more determination. So, no, they don't do it that way. The whole thing is when you're dealing in evil, you want superior evil to the other side, and you don't give things up, and you don't try to promote the principles of liberty by setting a good example, which we as a nation did in our early years. You know, other people said, the United States, I think they have something special going on, but that isn't the case now. It's a battle for wealth and control and money, and it's such a shame this is happening because it's not complex, it's not easy to change. We have more peace and we'd have more prosperity. Oh, you're a traitor.
Yeah, exactly. So very bad news, I think this whole thing is. And what's to stop if the president has the power to ban a website that he deems to be a foreign adversary? Well, maybe RT will go first. No one's going to complain, oh, it's Russian. But maybe other websites who are fully American. Maybe our show. We talk too much about foreign stuff. You know, we got to ban it. So be careful what you wish for, I think.
All right.